Atticus clumsily plopped down on the Dark Age-style toilet. The wooden seat was cold and rigid as his buttocks rubbed against it. He used one hand to cup his genitals and the other to lift his pint of Jack Daniels and take one more swig before the next unexpected sensation. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he began to control his breathing and push. He held his breath and bit his lip as his abdomen region tightened. The bear gazed upward, raising its massive skull, peering up at whatever it was that suddenly blocked the dim incoming light. Atticus cursed as the amount of alcohol in his system refused to pass on his stool, which was a common occurrence for him in those days. The bear reached its massive paw upward toward the man's anus. Its 5-inch yellow bacteria-ridden claws opened up as they neared his scrotum. They made contact, 2 of which pierced the man's skin and began pulling downward on the sack, ripping some flesh away, exposing their innards. Atticus shrieked and leapt off the seat, tearing even more flesh off as the bear's claws were still sunk in his scrotum. Atticus cupped himself as blood spewed out and quickly turned around to discover the lurking nightmare that was beneath him unknowingly just moments ago. Its eyes were wide and its lips snarled up, exposing its teeth. It reached its claw up through the toilet seat and lashed at Atticus once more, but missed. It seemed the creature was too large to fit through it, according to Atticus's assessment. He backed up toward the door, heart pounding in a drunken stupor, and knew that he needed immediate medical attention. But the lurking horror had something different in mind. What's up, guys? Iceman here. So this story is a really unusual one indeed. It's about a guy in the Deep South who had a rather unfortunate encounter with a black bear. But before I get into it, I'd like to thank you all for your support on this channel. And if you will, like the video, subscribe to the page, and paw that bell so you're notified next time I post a video. And if you want to support me further, you can become a channel member or a patron. Links in the description below. So let's get into this chilling tale. It wasn't always like this. Atticus was a strapping young boy when he was young, determined to work on the railroad like his father. But as the years progressed, his father became more abusive toward him, and living in a small logging town in rural Arkansas, Atticus would find himself alone and desolate. At one point, Atticus's father dropped him off on a stump in the woods and left him there for several days and nights all by himself. His father would go into town and enjoy himself at the bars, while also pursuing extracurricular activities with women other than his wife, who was stuck at home watching 3 other young children. Somehow, even with ravenous wolves and bears in the region, as well as mountain lions, Atticus survived the endeavor, feeding on blackberries and drinking from puddles in the ground. Days later, his father finally arrived, and perhaps disgruntled, found his youngest son and returned him home. Unfortunately, this observed behavior translated into Atticus's life, and throughout his adulthood, he became an alcoholic, an abuser of children and his wife, and many more things that shall not be mentioned. His lineage came from Ireland and arrived in America in the early 1800s to work on the railroad. But by the mid-1900s, when Atticus was a man, the railroad work dried up, so he, along with his friends, became lumberjacks and worked for a local lumber mill. They would get drunk during their breaks and crack jokes, and half the time not return home to their families after a long day's shift. Atticus, like all the families before him, was poor, and the money he did have, he spent on alcohol. In the beautiful state of Arkansas, amidst its rolling hills and dense forests, Black bears roam as a symbol of the state's rich natural heritage. The bears primarily inhabit the remote, forested regions of the Ozark Mountains, where they find ample food sources such as berries, nuts, insects, and occasionally small mammals. Despite their name, black bears can actually range in color from black to various shades of brown and even blonde, adding to their mystique.
Get out of here, boy. You ain't never gonna mount anything.
Atticus cursed his youngest child as he stumbled out of the house that morning, walking the 3 miles it took him to get to the logging camp. 7.5 hours later was when the outhouse event occurred. Atticus was terrified. He pulled his hand up out of his pants and held it in front of his face. It was dripping with blood. He gasped and felt for the door latch, knowing he had to escape the outhouse and get medical attention, no matter what the cost. The outhouse was near the lumber mill, in a desolate spot in the woods. It was about 50 yards away from the base camp, and his friends were most likely crashed out drunk. He fiddled with the door latch and slowly opened the door, peering through the crack. He once again looked down the wormhole in the toilet and only saw the rump of the bear, seemingly trying to escape it from a hole it dug from the outside. Atticus squeezed his private areas, trying to restrict the pouring blood. He took a deep breath and made his move. He stumbled out the door, nearly tripping down the step that led to the outhouse. He fumbled around the outside and caught his bearings. He looked all around and there was no sign of the bear, so he started making his way toward the campsite. It was then that he heard a rather unsettling sound, a sort of screech or whine, a bit antagonizing. He turned and noticed the large black bear facing toward him, with its back arched up like a cat. As soon as Atticus made eye contact with the animal, it hesitated in its tracks. It looked him up and down as if he were an unusual sight, but its curiosity was terrifying. Atticus stood and stared at the animal, noticing the intrigue in its big black eyes and the vast musculature throughout its body. The bear took a step toward him, and silently it was able to move. He wouldn't have guessed it were there if he weren't watching it with his own eyes. It was so stealthy, so silent, so mysterious. Atticus didn't know what to do. He looked around and saw no one, and knew he had to make his way back to the camp. He looked back to the bear, and it was still standing there, only about 7 feet behind him, facing toward him and watching him intently. Atticus turned and started swiftly walking away, and heard the footsteps behind him. While still walking, he turned his head to see the bear hastily approaching him, so he stopped and turned and shouted at the creature. And once again the bear hesitated, but this time its head was very low to the ground, and it looked as though it were about to charge.
Get out of here,
Atticus grumbled. Its head swayed, keeping its eyes on the man, and its back still arched. Atticus began walking backwards, keeping an eye on the creature, as he began picking up speed with a slight run, while still facing toward the bear. He was shocked over how quickly the animal was able to move, and it picked up pace. Atticus turned and ran as fast as he could to the camp, knowing the animal was right behind him, and suddenly, without warning, it crashed into him and took him to the ground. He struggled to turn belly up, and the bear wrapped its jaws around his face while holding him with its front paws. Atticus struggled and moaned, trying to fight off the bear, but to no avail. The bear turned him over onto his belly and began digging into his back, ripping apart his flannel shirt with its claws, and then sticking its mouth into the wound, pulling out gaping pieces of flesh. It utilized its massive weight to hold him down, and would raise up his head while chewing on clumps of his flesh. Atticus thrashed himself to the side, not believing what was happening to him. He jerked his head as far as he could to get a good view of the bear, and noticed it eating a clump from his back. With all his might, he struggled and tossed, and managed to wiggle out of the bear's grasp. For about a moment, Atticus struggled to his feet and began limping toward the campsite. He turned and saw the bear, standing there, still chewing on a piece of his flesh. But before he could get far at all, he was tackled to the the ground again. The bear ended up dragging Atticus's carcass into the thicket and half eating the man before caching away his corpse and defecating and urinating on the site. Several hours later, presumably, his half-eaten body was discovered, with a very frantic bear circling about. The bear was shot and killed by one of the logging members with a .30-30 rifle. It took 3 shots to down the bear, and it was said that it charged the man shooting it before he was able to get off the first shot. The bear collapsed and died, and was found to be a 350-pound Bruin. Seemingly, the bear dug a hole into the outhouse from the bottom, as it would forage through the excrement found within, and potentially used it as a watering hole as well. The legend of Atticus lives on. Jeez, what do you guys think about that story? The situation with Atticus is a really perplexing one. Who do you think is to blame here? His lineage, his grandfather, his father, or himself? On one hand, he seemed like a very crude character, but on the other, he had a hell of an upbringing. But nonetheless, this isn't the first story I've told on this channel that included one of those weird, rickety outhouses out in the woods, and it just seems like you gotta be careful if you're gonna use one of those. Their doors are generally quite flimsy, and you never know what's down there. But nonetheless, I appreciate you all for your support on this channel. And again, if you will, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit the bell so you're notified next time I post a video, and blessings to my channel members and patrons. Links in the description below. I'm curious what you have to say about this video in the comment section, and I will talk to you soon with more chilling tales from the Iceman.